Hello everyone, today we talk about the Mediterranean civilization, essentially from the rise of the Hellenes to the Roman conquest. The reason why I make this video is that in theory it's part of a broader introduction to our medieval history, manuals, ethnic background of Europe, and therefore it's a very long term, as we will see now, millennia long even, uh, condensation of the major events read according to a certain interpretation. But I'm actually preparing from a while. I hope I'm going to have the time for it. A series about an interpretation of European history through Indo-Aryan culture, and how this a stress culture to, say, be very objective about the different, let's say, proportion which this overlapped with the ethnic dimension, because it's really a big problem, right? And it's not so problem much in the measure in which these movements happen today. I don't know, if you talk about the Mycenaeans, for example, today we don't even know where technically they were probably a mix between very archaic Indo-Europeans and pre-in fact Indo-European Greek peoples. As you know, the whole idea of the Bronze Age collapse, the idea of a Hellenic Middle Ages, as is being termed, and eventually the Dorian invasions, something that, as far as I know, I'm no expert on it, but historiography has come to interpret in very different ways from what we were used to look at. And in part I agree with this. I mean, there is definitely in history this tendency of looking at certain changes as too drastic, as if big, even sudden changes that surely happen at some point had to do with a break or a discontinuity with before, and we lack at that point properly the intelligence to understand how certain changes actually occurred more at a cultural level than actually at a structural one from a certain point of view, and that therefore this cultural change has to be explained concretely. And it's something we have seen also in the Middle Ages, right? If you look at the collapse, let's say, of late antiquity, that is enormously debated, especially in Southern Europe, it's not clear at all at some points, but it surely existed according, depending on the parameters that you use, and definitely in other places too, right? We say, well, in the north maybe this was more accentuated, well, but yes, what was there in the north, therefore collapsing or regressing, that compared to what existed before. So it's not easy sometimes to address how certain changes occurred without understanding the history of ideas, right? And as you know, I have a very peculiar and developing a very peculiar historical interpretation that has to do with the application of Clausewitzian theory to the main political, military, and social changes that occurred historically. And as a medievalist specializing in Western Europe and also having written something about that, I had to frame and interpret some, for example, the creation of the Latin Germanic world as such, right, during the from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages, to explain how these cultures compenetrated each other, how synthesis from which essentially most of our Western identity concretely meant fundamentally stems from, and how it was possible, for example, areas that were Romance in tongue, in culture, and dramatically more populated than compared to the to essentially the peoples that of Germanic origin that migrated in there, to Germanize culturally so deeply, right? And this obviously is a political choice, right? It was explained by not how it was conceived before. Most of these changes as the brutal suppression of whatever existed before. On the contrary, it was the other way around, but the other way around was formed in the scientific, the conscious, the aware decision of creating those cultures on the base of a different cultural pattern. Again, even here, not because of a evident dichotomy or a specific rationalization, but because politics and society came to function given the context, given the environment, given the all things that are also still very debated, like in fact the agricultural demographic collapse, how it happened, what dynamics it reflected, and so on. And naturally trying to evaporate all of this from the technologistic bias, the idea that somewhat there's a monofactorial explanation for it, and so on. So when it comes actually to Hellenic history, and we know much less, of course, in proportion, but especially for the pre-classical times, but we assist to something similar, in my opinion, and that we'll explain better in another video. But what is fascinating of this chapter in history is, of course, this unspeakably exceptional and really unique dynamic that took place in this area of essentially of southeastern Europe, around the Aegean Sea, broadly meant, also encompassing Western Anatolia and so on, where what we call the Hellenic civilization flourished at some point. And not just because we are rationally, say, scientifically, also logically, but fundamentally Greek children, for that matter, right, as Westerners, but because of the impact that this had on the world as a consequence, right? When I started Schwerpunkt, I was very careful in not unbalancing myself too much, because I knew less, and I thought, after all, that all theories have to be accepted cum grano salis, and with so therefore a healthy skepticism, and being somewhat also mindful that there are certain ideologies that try to essentially twist history for the sake of it, and not necessarily are wrong in the in the essentials, but in the way the thing is interpreted and eventually used. And this is a completely different topic, but it's important because everything I say here naturally has an impact, right? It's like when I say that, every time there is Germanic in the title of a video, I get triple views compared to normality, right? There is naturally a cultural phenomenon that is quite notorious actually in today's popular culture. It's not very flattering, but it's for those at least who buy into it with conviction, and they can't see the thing in different terms, but it's something I have to cope, and I think I have been fairly, I would have talked about those things anyway, but always it was important to address them in a fashion that could make the same people who would consume that reflect on how much deeper and more complex the picture is, right? And it's something that goes, it gets down to very deep civilizational interpretations, right? Because from one side, you can't consider civilization as a linear process, and buying into the idea of progress, and that there was a sort of, root value or core that was that allegedly would have remained there throughout the millennia till this day. Is something that I completely reject, meaning that if anything, I believe in the seminal phase of this interpretation, but I believe that this thing is being in fact diluted over time, and that the fact that it's diluted over time is not the reason of the decline of the civilization per se, but rather the lack of let's say a further rational scientific culture grafted on such moral and valorial standards that such peoples had, right? It's a phenomenon that even here has not much to do with the pollution because of other cultures, because of immigration, etc., because many peoples effectively had the same exact trend, right? That were different stages of development historically. Some peoples never remained in the Paleolithic until somebody with a plane arrived. So it's difficult even to make comparisons. But let's say at least in Western history, we should at least be habituated to talk about such comparative measures in a objective fashion, given that in Europe we had so much. And in fact, when we talk especially about these origins or even the permanence of certain tribal cultures when they were documented by other more advanced, well, we are very lucky, because in other parts of the world there wasn't such a specific balance between a certain stage of development of historiographical, in fact, works and so on. And naturally, the more you go back in time, the more it's difficult, right? So Hellenic history is a bit tricky in this regard, because the Greek civilization presents, from one side, an element, definitely an allogenous element, that compared to properly to the region, to the area, right? It has to do with the Indo-European migrations and the spirit, in a sense, and that dominating culture that managed to, inform so distinctively what, in fact, we call as the Hellenic world and so on, given that there were these in fact, Indo-European peoples, the Pelasgians, so that always remained there with a very heavy mark in that situation. We will see, especially in another video, why. But because there was a great continuity at the same time for this pre-Indo-European strata, and conferring to the Hellenic world initially a very strong push and drive that culminated debatably on how much you consider the Hellenic world but it is definitely a product of that, and even having these boundaries between Indo-European peoples, definitionally, and also with others, frankly, right? If you read the Iliad, you realize that in the Near East they wrote exactly the same thing, right? Exactly the same stories, with the same heroes, with the same ethos, with the same symbolisms, almost with the same gods, you would say. But that, let's say, we're talking about Alexander, right? And so this boom that is essentially the single greatest conqueror and that existed in the history of mankind. I don't consider, for example, the Mongols as such, not even King Genghis Khan, as necessarily the greatest conqueror in the history of mankind. I don't believe that, because that was a much more mediated world, a much more developed world, if you want, right? That you can even look at the steppe, but if you look at medieval China, it was definitely a world that had seen a lot before, that had evolved, right, and developed in civilizationally. Doesn't matter which ups and downs, right? Men do not forget what they have created, right? So when we talk about the first millennium BC, we are still looking at a world that is that young, that is that primitive, actually. We would be surprised, even in the in the might of the Hellenic and the Roman civilizations, how miserable, materially speaking, these worlds were, right? And we have the negative bias towards the Middle Ages as a sort of black hole and so on, where everything was doing. But frankly, it was already a more developed system, more advanced system in many ways than what the ancient one had been. And the ways we have interpreted the stories naturally have a lot to do with the way we want to see the thing, right? But there is, in fact, this observation that is evident also in the rise of Macedon and the development, in fact, of the Hellenistic world, the creation of it, this romantic synthesis, cultural synthesis that was universally oriented. That obviously shows at a certain point the failure of the civilization. That is to say, not just Rome took over eventually, and there was obviously the possibility this may have not happened for many reasons. Nothing is deterministic, etc. But we are assisting to essentially a conservativistic almost confinement of the Hellenic world, if you want, within itself, which is so much that in fact the Macedons were something very different, and not surprisingly provided with this a radically more aristocratically military mindset than what the the Hellenic, the Hellenic citizens, let's say, could have developed by certain cultures, and that tells the story naturally of a very different change, a very deep change from, let's say, the Hellenic, let's say the Indo-European invaders, and that culture was brought in, especially what we call as the Dorian invasion, in spite of all the debate that exists on what actually happened. That and the prosperity of the polis that, however, culminated with a weakening of the moral capacity of the system. So we're taken over eventually by the Macedons, by the Romans, and that in spite of their cultural primacy that they indeed maintained, from a philosophical, a scientific, a literary point of view, still, this world was in fact taken over by somebody else, and it developed, if you want, even further the sense of its own conclusion, we would say, because according to the Greeks, well, they had created perfection, right? So it was like anything that would happen in reality, including being taken over by other powers, was somewhat, too dissonant with the reality of Hellenic perfection, therefore had to be somewhat ignored, right? And this is what it's criticized unfairly, like this is naturally an extremization of the idea, but it still renders the idea in what we call as Byzantine culture, and the idea that this intellectual superiority at some point is a double-edged sword, from which, yes, you have you are objectively intellectual superiority has a lot to do with political and military success, but at the same time it rests on itself at the point that it may grow you detached and properly dissonant with the realization that it's not just intelligence that is needed, but also a principle of force, and also a vision of reality that has to essentially translate itself into it in order to be called action, right? And the sacred value that this had, right, which other peoples, such as, for example, the Romans, had always maintained instead, even if they were rougher, more primitive culturally speaking, they had never quite abandoned, and that they had always seen instead as their own destiny, their own fate. In fact, in Byzantine culture, also that mentality flowed, but over time, let's say the Hellenic element took over again, right? With all the changes, with all the differences, and as linguistically speaking, the areas that remained under the Byzantine culture were fundamentally and culturally the leaderships properly. They were the direct, let's say, heirs of the Hellenic, what had been the Hellenic legacy, right? They weren't the Hellenes anymore, but they shared a lot about that. We've made actually a lot of videos. If you're interested in this specifically, here and there, we will keep talking about it. The differences, for example, between the Roman Senate and the Constantinopolitan Senate, how they were created, on which premises, on which basis, with which criteria of career, for example, of selection, of cooptation, right? And you realize that these cultural, the Latin and the Hellenic cultural legacies were definitely, Italic and the Hellenic cultural legacies were definitely very different. It had always been, and in a sense, this contrast between the two dimensions and what the world had been shaped by, like them, had never come apart, right? And this has actually a very deep connection still with the way we are as Westerners, right? Even, I mean, this encompasses any country, any culture, including, I don't know, the modern Greece and so on. But it has to do with which models, given we arrived at this point of basically of amnesia, of historical, of cultural amnesia about the past of Europe, for which Europeans, factually, like any other people in the world, do not know anymore anything about their history. I mean, they never did concretely, but at least those who were in charge at the time before did, and so the others would follow along those patterns and would also live individually, even unawarely, so by certain models. do not quite, exist anymore, right? As I often say, you cannot be a Westerner if you're not educated as a Westerner, right? You cannot be a Westerner if you don't have Western values, right? I don't have any racial prejudice in this sense. There are non-white people, there are real Westerners, and there are certain white people who are absolutely at some level even devoid of culture, because at that point, like, if you're that ignorant or uneducated and unaware of even the things you're doing, because there's no thing like tradition anymore. Like, that's, as a conservative, I believe that, I hate how in the West narrowly meant we buy the idea that in some more backward parts of our own, say, cultural horizon, there lays the true traditions and identities. No, those are exactly the weaker people. We have arrived to the top, and we are the ones who should keep taking the lead, right? And no, right, being like kind of more Western kind of democratic, that doesn't mean to be less of a Westerner per se. Right, the reverting to tribalism, identity policy, racialism, etc., is a denial of Western values at the core, even in the most aggressive and expansionistic and even imperialistic that I think as Europeans we have, right? And there is nothing wrong in it, right? The bullshit, okay, of critical race theory, all the thing is completely an abomination of the dignity of human mankind, I believe, as, all the cultures that allegedly are, counterposed to the Western one were exclusively based, as the Europeans, when they were at that same level of development, on killing, raping, and enslaving, right? Native Americans, Africans, everybody, right? And therefore there is, if you don't feel proud about the fact that at some point, like any culture in mankind had slavery, you're just an imbecile, right? You're just an ignorant. You just don't have an historical perspective, and you're worthless in the path of human civilization at this stage of development and potential education. And the reasoning here is that the reason why it seems so that we are declining as Westerners is that we do not put moral forces anymore, that the way we complain is just not reflected by action, by what actually was at the root of all the Indo-European, and not only that, right? Because there were other people's reasoning in the same way. It's just that our combination is something contingential, right? It happened randomly, right? But it did happen that way, so we have to acknowledge that, historically speaking. But it was based on the sacred value of pure action, right? And it doesn't take for a Clausewitzian channel to connect that with the same Clausewitzian theory and the concept of total war that wasn't absolutely anything like what the Nazis completely misinterpreted, for which they screwed up the entire fate of their own country for in a dramatic bath of blood in which they took away all the innocency in it. But the exact contrary, that is to say, the purity of thought regarding the necessity of action, based on rationality, on determination, and on properly moral forces, is what has built the pillars of civilization. And for some reason or another, the Westerners came to have that synthesis for a long part of their history in a more qualitatively consistent way than others, right? And the way the world changes has nothing to do with that, because that's a universal value, right? And if you think that has to do just with the way you look like, or identity policy and all this thing, you are denying the same root of the Western civilization. That is to say, again, it's not because you're born in a European country, you speak an Indo-European language, or you look white or whatever, that has anything to do with you being Westerner. That has virtually nothing to do with being Westerner. And in fact, your ancestors, coming from the steppe, having this dramatically, violent, because that's the idea, view of what the life and the role of man. If they had seen what modern, alt-righters or alleged traditionalists actually are, they would have simply spit in their face, because they would have considered them as subhuman beings, right? And that was a world that, of course, evidenced that quite clearly, right? Because this has nothing to do with a scientific idea of racism, etc. That's literally the fact that at the time you had to be in a way that modern people are completely incapable of understanding neurocognitively and adapting also physically anymore, right? Those weren't superheroes. They were just set in a context that made them unequivocally understand what needed to be done or not, right? For the world of the time. Today there is none of that. So just pretending to imitate that because you look in a certain way is just a proof of your individual weakness, because you're automatically incapable of doing anything else, right? Our task today as Westerners is to be morally superior again, and that's being just morally miserable and abject and fundamentally stupid and underdeveloped and insignificant, because let's be honest, who is significant today anymore most of the times as an individual, as a citizen, as somebody in the world, right? What difference can you make? What difference did you make for real? How much heroically did you bring it to the extreme consequences? Practically you've never done anything even thinking of that. Well, these people lived soaked in this idea, and it was terrible, right? It was terrible because at the time reality was terrible, as today it's not. Even where it does appear terrible, comprehensively, complexively, it's nothing compared to what these people were constantly soaked in, immersed in. So if you don't believe in the sacrality of existence, for example, and of the world, and how divine power intervenes in it, and what's your role in it, but you cannot simply fit anyone who does believe in these things anymore. I mean, honestly. And how can you teach to, I wouldn't say, just somebody born in the 21st century, but even just, in the last generations, or what this means, right? The cultural parameters are completely not there. We live in a secularized, modernized, desacralized world that basically has nothing to do with what those people believe to make certain things happen in a proportional way. So at least even putting ourselves in a comparative, intentionally positive attitude towards universality, right, and mankind. So we will again talk about this better in some other videos. For today, let's say the concept here that is important is to have a long-term perspective of how the phenomenon works. Like, if you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, because that's where fundamentally the thing had started, where civilization began in approximately in a Western perspective, right? It began from there, right? Europe was fundamentally civilized by Asian and African, namely Egyptian, civilizations. It brought, let's say, to this continuous, expansion of, of contacts, of interactions, of exposure to material wealth, to the idea that you could begin to actually manage more, to live more, and building hierarchies on that rational capacity, right? So in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern reality, this there was definitely already an Indo-European element pre-existing. It's uncertain in the especially if you go before the first millennium BC, to track exactly what all these waves actually were, because most of the times, and how it happens historically, etc., these migrations are not meant to leave a dramatic trace, especially in those times and places, let's say, but it's often about who they come to rule on, right, and how they come to be absorbed at which level, with which level of cultural impact on the local cultures, right? So Indo-Europeans at that point in those areas, having mixed with the pre-existing populations, had already stabilized in territorial frames of very varied width, right? But already was there, right? The great culture of war chariot had spread. It was keep spreading actually towards the western, the northern of Europe. It was still sending inputs and waves, right, of conquerors over this more sedentary areas, right, and with already this very evident cultural difference that was forming relatively to the celestial, military, virile, element from on the steppe and the chthonic agricultural fertility female, if you want, one in the Pelasgians, in this area, in the Aegean, and this in this phenomenon we observe the acquisition, the gradual acquisition of a leading cultural function of the people that we use to name Hellenic or Greek. The etymologies are actually not very helpful because in this context, because they're just after some places in Greece that were how they were eventually called. These peoples, Aristotle says that the Graikoi were the original name of the Hellenians, but we don't know as much as we would like to know also. But culturally speaking, we do see, after what we call as the Dorian invasions, etc. For example, think about geometric painting, right? That is quite, especially looking at what art was before, that's quite powerfully and evidently a geometric pattern that Indo-Europeans used to reflect the perfection of the skies, from which all their force and system of values fundamentally derived on, that was paralleled by mirrored in the psyche, etc. Then eventually, with the development of classical Greece, eventually Hellenism, that purity of the forms fundamentally, and of the concepts, of the intention, this extremely aggressive warlike culture that gets diluted in something more naturalistic, more contemplative, more so. This were the phase which they had sanitarized, had gentrified, and also stratified in ways that for which the masses were now ever more framed under some oligarchs and so on, and eventually Romanization. The Romans arrived, under giving them under control, and the Romans, for example, had a very poor, as you know, opinion of such peoples, right? They were. It's kind of funny when kind of modern scholars would like to make you buy that the ancient world was a tolerant world in a modern sense, or that there were not ethnic discriminations. Read Horace, read Apuleius. Look at what it was said ethnically about, I don't know, the shorter or the darker, or look at what properly from an anthropological or point of view of history or religions, what actually these peoples believed, or those who had conquered. Right, the Romans were absolutely obsessed by these concepts. They believed literally that they were the elect race, the elect people. Right, that's something that just the Jews had believed, the Franks would believe, and very few people in history had, with it, probably the Romans in the most radically absolute way that you can imagine, and had that stemmed from that militaristic mindset that, in a sense, the Hellenic people itself had already lost, because we explained this many times, that the Hellenic, not the Hellenistic, because the Hellenistic was based on a different principle. In fact, it was more reminiscent of that, and in fact, that's what Rome actually followed at the time. But Hellenic, in the sense of course, what does the hoplitic phalanx actually represent? What does the part-time citizen soldier of, let's say, of classical Athens actually embodies? Right. The only exception in the Hellenic world, we will make easily videos of this. But these are very unknown historiographical topics. It's not even remotely a matter of personal opinion. This is literally what was like, with the sole exception of the Spartans, that not surprisingly, they weren't actually this big deal in military terms. If you look at the surrounding peoples in the ancient world and so on, it's just for the Greeks, right? And for the fact that they had retained more than other, in fact, Hellenic polis, this kind of sacred concept of action and even of mystique of power that made them, if you want, closer to Rome, even being something extremely different by many standards, but that still brought at the center the idea that every Spartan, so as every freeman, every warrior, had to be, in fact, the same, had to be a fighter, had to be free, and had to be equal, right? It was a collegiality of power, was much more, but still mystically attached to the idea of power that does reflect those Indo-European tribal customs that had remained. If you want, even to a military system that was too traditional for the time being, but it was still capable of changing. We made videos on the last Spartan military developments that by the 2nd century they were actually impressive, right? Considering what is usually told about Spartan traditionalism, which is to be it's excessive as an idea, at least if you absolutize that. In any case, what I would like to stress here is the centrality of the Greeks in taking over essentially Eastern Mediterranean, and we see it. I mean, it's not just a cultural thing. It's not just about philosophy. It's literally about the political, military, and social systems that they had created, right? While it did pass, famously enough, in the phalangitic ideal, of the foot citizen soldier, right? And soldier is not even the best term to define that, in an anti-aristocratic fashion. So against, if you want, that sense of leadership, of heroic nature that the Bronze Age had dominated, with the guy covered in metal arriving on the battlefield on chariot and so on. The Hoplitic phalanx is a cultural reaction to that, right? And so is what we call as Hellenic democracy, right? And still, in spite of this, of course, dilution, and so actual civilizational improvement for example, in the rationalization of the military instrument, the centrality of the political decision in the effectiveness of the military employment, right? Think about Athena, right? If that greater dilution is embodied in Athens, still Athens is the city of Athena, right? And the Greeks had come to that point clearly, to the realization that warriors are inferior, right, to more developed military systems. That reason that Athena always crushes Ares all the freaking time, because she's the goddess of war in the form of discipline, of rationality, of cold blood, right? Athena is completely merciless. She kills without blinking an eye, right? Ares is not like that. And Ares is more stupid than Athena, right? And this is a foundational principle of the superiority of Western civilization. I mean, understanding the fact that we came to provide the world with prosperity, advancement, rationality, scientificity. This all stems in conceptually within the idea, of course, that tribal cultures are morally inferior. Again, they don't know anything outside of killing, raping, and enslaving, right? A civilization, a greater quality of life, the recognition of the dignity of human life per se comes only from more developed civilizations, also from cultures. And we can be proud, given that we all were warriors at some point, that we managed to crush warriors under the heels of citizen soldiery and the superiority of modern civilization, right? And it's something that we should never be to give for granted, because human beings are always the same. It's just the civilizational development that changes, right? So we made an improvement in this process, right? As I said before, this is not a negative thing. The answer for preserving the values of Western civilizations, they are universal. They're not Western because there is a Western color to it, but because it is the right scientific combination of factors for humanity. Seems to be degenerating because we don't put that moral effort in it anymore, not because there is something intrinsically different in it. That's where conservatives, and especially the extremistic ones, the the ones that are actually not even conservatives, right? Because alt-righters are just socialists and nothing else. They're national socialists and nothing else, and so they absolutely do not belong to the dignity of Western civilization, and that's why we exterminated Nazis and fascists as much as we should have done with the communists as well. But the idea is that they don't understand that, because again they stopped to a level of development that is not satisfactory for the quality of Western civilization at this stage of development. So this superiority is what brought the Greeks on the fore, right? The idea that this system, as diluted as it was, still within the phalanx, there was the concept of an equal mass of free men, after all, that were fighting all for a common political purpose, and could crush, like, you know what phalanx means? Phalanx means like a rolling truck, right? You know, that literally smashes like a steamroller that paves that. So that's actually kind of an offensive ideal, and that's also what we tend to forget. Never buy into Reganian hoplitism, that is how historiography has developed the concept of Hellenic warfare, of, you know, by a generation of people that were traumatized by the Vietnam War, were scared by hand-to-hand combat. Hellenic warfare, albeit not professional by definition, was actually aggressive, right? Also, that's because what a militia tendentially can rely just on, I mean, the idea of cold blood, etc., was an ideal, just an ideal. You can't quite have that without military professionalism, right? But also you can't quite have military professionalism or pure discipline, as Thucydides describes it, without the virtus, right? Without the idea that there's still a bit of warrior in all of us, whether we like it or not, and that we can use it for a good purpose, actually, right? As long as it remains safely framed and caged in a jacket of discipline. Right? Discipline means that if you ever dare to think that you have a glimpse of individualism because you think that you are special, or that compared to all the rest of the world you're somewhat meaningful, you have to be broken, you know, with massive hits until you start reasoning the way you have when you have to be in battle in ranks, right? So imagine this applied to the fringe, to the scum of society from which extremism comes from, right? Some alt-righter or, you know, or communist extremist to be brought under real discipline, which is this one, right? To be literally destroyed as an individual and rebuilt to learn how to obey to authority. That's why those are fringe scum, because they are nothing but the reflection of a tribalism and nothing else. Right, and tribal peoples are military weak. They declare their military inferiority by their own individualism. That's why warriorism has been defeated, because they do not understand the superiority of discipline. Right, so this was the world that made Athena the symbol of the entire civilization. So reflect on that. Reflect on the power of that, and how those phalanges took over the most prolific of that world, what was Hellenic civilization, that was still, after all, a demographic one, differently from the one of other peoples. The Phoenicians didn't do that. There was a demographic, a population load that had to be still conceived in the way Indo-Europeans had done during the migrations, like the idea that there was no space. In a certain point, there must go conquer somebody else. This was at the root of all Celtic, Italic, Germanic, all the Indo-European culture was based on that. Were based on that because there was a concrete need. Because there was literally no space, not enough resources. They had to go found other centers, and the way the Hellenic world developed in this sense, taking the seas, becoming shipmaster, having a dramatic naval power developing, and in this sense controlling mentally that world. That's where the superiority of the intellect stands, right? It's the idea that, you know, in those Greeks, Aegean archipelagos, there is never a place where you are where you cannot see land at some point, and therefore projecting yourself with the mind of what's next. If you wonder how Hellenic philosophy was born, well, this is a simplistic interpretation, but don't think that doesn't have to do actually with it, with that unicity, that specificity, that idea of entrepreneurial risk. That is also a strategic one, right? This is not to say that other influxes didn't arrive from elsewhere, but they arrived from, for example, the Achaemenid Empire, in which Greece was factually part of, right? If you don't want to count mainland Greece, that technically was just a remote and small peripheral peninsula of a world that the Achaemenids considered, entire, given the extension of their empire rightfully as the entire world, but still considered that Greek philosophy was born on the Asian coast, right? Miletus and other centers that were within the Achaemenid, were under satrapic government, and the Achaemenids, after all, were nothing but Indo-Europeans themselves, right? As they were essentially Medians that had part of this greater waves of nomadic peoples that had permeated and molded and crushed against, but reinforced and both in the process the sedentary civilizations, the great ones of the Mesopotamia, of Egypt, and so on. And so that's the power of the syncresis. That's the power of intelligence, of the new that you have acquired. Once something comes within the range of the human intelligence, that is sakti, that is kept. It's not forgotten, right? The Bible, even Hellenic mythology, that tells you how it is, right? There is a moment where you break that virginity, when you have known, and so it is, and that's that knowledge in itself bears the burden of sin and responsibility. But that's exactly what this was, that these cultures were ethically based on. It was on the idea of acquiring the faculty of command on the base of such increased power, and the burden came with it, right? And we've seen it also in so many other cultures, because you cannot command if you don't suffer in this sense, right? You wouldn't be human, right? So in a world today that rejects suffering as an instrument of self-improvement, right, where the sacred is exactly in the opposite direction, well, you can hardly see how leadership could emerge. I don't even want to know how many publications about containing the word leadership in the title seems to be an obsession in Western world, especially in American culture, have been published with everybody thinking what leadership fundamentally is, without even starting to acknowledge these ideas, right? And proving just by the scale of such publishing how evidently nobody came up with a right answer. It's an illusion that most of the leadership that is put on the fore there is nothing but kind of a warrioristic, tribalistic one, and it's obviously doomed to lose in the third millennium. So the linguistic customs of the Hellenic people definitely trace back to a Indo-European root that is previous to the immigrations happened directly or indirectly from the north within the Aegean area, right? But the Hellenes formed themselves gradually, as we have seen, as a people of very high cultural creativity. After the meeting, right, the encounter with actually thick groups of other Indo-Europeans that had, immigrated gradually, and with a civilization that in the Greek peninsula and in the Aegean islands, and especially in Crete, as we know, the Minoan culture pre-existed already in the third millennium, and it was in continuous relation through maritime commercial routes, with the experiences of the Asian and African countries that faced the Eastern Mediterranean. So there was, again, what we see in the Hellenic culture in its incredible prolificity, right, and the enormous cultural legacy that has left to us to this day, right? If we're talking about culture, indeed, there is a component, like a good third of Western civilization fundamentally stems from this scientific accomplishment of the Hellenics, right? And naturally, with this very complex overlapping with pre-existing Pelasgian cultures that were, however, bearing a very different cultural metrics, right? That eventually, in the Hellenic case, prevailed, right, on the long run, right? But in this first encounter, right, in this first, this was sort of in gravitation, right? It was a sort of, it's what the like in all these mythologies, there is the element of the sky, of the rain, of the thunder, that is, of course, the one of war, the father, right, that inseminates the earth, the mother, the fertility, the chthonic one. And there is a deep divide between the two, because when we see with the Indo-Europeans is the first model, right? Even though they always coexisted by a certain degree, because of course they were never pure, distinguished peoples, right? There was always something later on, but the latter being the Pelasgian one, right? And the first one bearing in this atrocious moral quality for which the faculty of command, to which the faculty of command was connected, right? So the Hellenic tradition, in this sense, began very early, right? These relations are a bit all the ones in which we measure the life of the Hellenic people. That is, before, during, and after the moment in which they found themselves from the essentially from the 15th to the 13th century BC in its cultural epicenter in Mycenae, in the Peloponnese, and that intensified, however, in the first millennium BC with the creation of the polis, right? So Hellenic cities, each one with a territory on its own, right? So it's as if it had been the installation of certain tribal groups within this pre-existing centers that were all provided with still this own sense of independence and identity, right? And remember that even just on the verge of the Persian Wars, the standard form of government was actually not democracy, right? It was tyranny, right? And it had been actually a revival exactly in those first in those years before, in part on the influence of other models, because of course even the same polis conceptually is like urbanization began elsewhere, right? Indo-Europeans didn't know what cities were, as most barbarians fundamentally, and so you can argue that, of course, Hellenic civilization owes a lot to the hardware and the cultural insight, etc., of the Near East. So there's no doubt about that, right? Never divide, and also never think that the Near East is not Europe, or it's not European. Let's say, if you talk about the Hittites, if you think about even the Assyrians, the same Achaemenids, as we were saying before, they all have that. We're the sea peoples in this, right? Because nobody quite knows, but they were eventually connected to those broader waves of it coming from, again, always from that warlike north that eventually invaded, settled, was absorbed, and then other waves came, and that's basically most of the history of mankind at that point. And from this contrast, that properly these two models had defined themselves through war, right, or also through exchange, of course, but through peaceful interaction. But the fact that there was always a political balance, a competitive power, once against the other. right? So this happened in the, from Greece. There was this expansion essentially on the western coast of Asia Minor, as I was saying before, in Cyrenaica. And broadly speaking, later on, the settlement of Hellenic mercantile nuclei in all the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, up until the flourishing of what we call classical Greece, spiritually gravitating on the polis of Athens, right? This is quite important because there are many parallelisms in modernity. What did make modernity in our Western identity? Well, spiritually, culturally, Athens embodies what with this classical Hellenic civilization stood in. It's like if you think about humanism, it's Florence. Like there are those very specific places, and what is important to realize is of course that these were exceptions. Notable exceptions, the most important ones, if you want, but that in the surrounding, such the reality was different, was mitigated, right? The reason why so much output came from there was naturally a lot of that let's say they had gotten it right from a moral point of view, and the consequence is that they enriched themselves dramatically through thalassocracy. So in the process, there was, even if you want a decline of that quality, but in the process, the enrichment of those individuals that began from the middle class also to put out a dramatic amount of civilization, historiographically, scientifically, philosophically, and so on. That's why we call that. It's not just a matter of wealth distribution, but it is also this progressed, mental rigor, if you want, and elaboration that is importantly it must be at the root also a political and a strategical culture, right? But what we see in Athens, if you want, is something that if you distance from it, comes always less, right? I mean, let's be honest. When we think about classical Greece, we're talking only about Athens and Sparta, because factually, those were the models of what we, the most successful ones. But in the rest, the same Greeks considered, I don't know, the Boeotian or the Aetolian, like something else, right? The borderline Greeks, because they weren't quite as culturally neat as what the local, Athenian model actually was. And this is true because, in a sense, they were more the others were more barbarian, right? They saw less that principle of democracy, that sense of absolute reason, that sense also of the if you want, of secularization that happened in the process of modernization. And this is reflected, even interestingly, as military historians we see it, from a different type of phalanx, right? A less homogeneous one that was more accompanied by cavalry. The same is true for the colonies, right? The colonies of mainland Greece were essentially the only place where true hopelessism ever existed. And I even defy you to tell me exactly where is a battle in mainland Greece where you actually see the phalanx in the model that we think operating without kind of differences in, I don't know, there's maybe cavalry over there's maybe a different formation over there's maybe it's something that is not quite the same, because everything changes, right? This is an ideal, and we are very much Greek children in the moment in which we realize that how that prototype is a sort of hypothesis of something that by itself never quite existed, because it's a Platonic concept. It's an idea it's an absolute idea that, of course, in reality doesn't quite exist, right? So that's in a way just the moment in which, at the acme of Hellenic civilization, this began to go down, because it kind of began to fall in love with itself at the point of not being able to produce what the superiority that they had achieved objectively, right? Already the colonies, as we were saying before, you see that They fought against different peoples. They had a different internal political, social balance. They were other grounds, literally. So there's no such thing like the phalanx as we mentioned, right? Look at Syracuse. That becomes the most powerful of Hellenic cities. We were making a video about the Battle of Himera some month ago. Well, there was something already very different in properly military consistency before, and also never underestimate in this regard the fact that operatism was something very, very short in time in the way we intended, right? That still at the beginning of the Persian Wars, there were reminiscences of that kind of heroic warfare that had existed before. There was never like a moment in which there was a stage of pure classical phalangitic order, right? This thing always changed, right? It came to change again during the Peloponnesian War, when it had reached the apex. So it's ever changing. It's never stopping. And this is the case for any civilization, any culture. That's why you can't just be content of being somebody. Then when you can't define what that somebody is, if you can't control what that somebody is, and if you actually, the world is changing, you don't even accept that it's changing. So, and because you're not acting on it. So, as you were saying before, from this broader Hellenic background emerged the greatest epopee in the history of mankind, of Macedons and Greeks under the guide of Alexander the Great. So the greatest commander in the history of mankind. This is also not an opinion which you can say, oh no, because I have my favorite guy. No, it doesn't mean anything. It has no historical or scientific value whatsoever. Alexander the Great accomplished the greatest scale of, by moral forces involved, which is the only parameter that you can use in these things, the greatest conquest in the history of mankind. Right? You cannot pick a Roman commander or a Mongol commander saying, those made it. No, nobody did. Also because everybody was absolutely obsessed with Alexander. Right? The Romans, the medievals, you think that they were after, they were radically obsessed, but I mean a real obsession. As much as an average hoplite, even if it was not a professional, was radically obsessed with the psychopathic serial killer of Achilles and wanted to imitate him at any cost. So the civilization was rightfully obsessed with Alexander the Great as a meter of the greatest superiority ever achievable, right? And ever achieved historically in the world. Because let's not forget, this thing happened, right? Like that, a commander from a stinky Balkan country in the fourth century managed to conquer the entire known world in some years. Right? This is not even considered remote. This person plus made it kind of shape the world in his own image. Right? And this was the greatest accomplishment, the greatest incredible, uncalculable, unframeable, unmeasurable accomplishment of Hellenic civilization. This was the moment in which the balance of factors brought to this spearhead, right, the diamond tip, to essentially to devastate the entire vision of the world that any people had ever had up to that point in the history of mankind. We cannot understand the greatness of this mind that was able to unite in a single one, East and West, that was able to think of all such an accomplishment in a world created in itself, right? And this was an enormously missed opportunity, right? Alexander has been studied in ways that we will see that have presented if you want, even some contradictions, right? There are Uranic as much as Chthonic elements in Alexander, for which we cannot identify in it a merely in fact, Uranic, military, equestrian, virile dimension in Alexandrine culture, because this was naturally coming to cope with worlds that were forcibly brought together at levels that were too quick for a positive integration. Hellenism survived Alexander, but the faculty of command of his creation did not, right? So while his corpse were still warm, the empire was already crumbling, and this naturally gave birth, as you know, to some, the greatest powers of the time: the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, the Antigonids, also because Macedon was there, the Bactrians, and others. But if you want, the promise had been set, right? The celestial deity of the sky had passed through this man, had showed what could be achieved, and what to which worlds and perspectives and scale of command that mankind could be elevated to. Other peoples lived up to that dream, right? And reaching, not individually but complexively, a much greater impact, right? The rise of Rome is truly and possible the single most important thing that happened in the history of human civilization. It's not even about Western identity. It's something that I also began to interpret in a more balanced way. There were other empires and so on, but quite not, right? After these years spent studying constantly, again, military history, all these contexts, Clausewitzian theory, I reinforced granitically my idea that fundamentally the Roman Empire set a moral standard that is factually the one after which any other possible power could ever be measured through. In the evangelical capacity of providing the universe with that force from the single individual. Again, this was already set by Alexander, but the measure in which it was extended as an order, as an authority, as a hierarchy, as an identity, that far exceeded the system. And the proof being that the Hellenistic world succumbed to the Roman one. And again, this is not about tracing rigid boundaries between peoples in general. This is about acknowledging the fact that there were some communities that didn't have the balance to live up to the expectation, that didn't maintain that unity that was required to maintain the faith in that principle of pure action, right? And that lost the glory of the sky, that flew away back to the heavens to descend on other peoples. So, as we have seen, this Macedonian earthquake brought to the creation of these powers, from Macedon to Egypt, from Syria to Iran, even up to Western India, famously enough. And the game continued, in a sense, because from one side, the Iranic, Indian ones were brought under the pressure of the nomad Indo-Europeans of the steppes, and that were destined to disappear. In fact, in 3 centuries practically before the Common Era, under their invasions, right? So that tells you also about the substratum. Who should have had to maintain the control. Naturally, Greek culture was important in those places. It actually was predating Alexander's enterprise, right? A power like Bactria existed mostly because of the Cretans that had, that had immigrated, been deported there by the Achaemenids, that also, rose up in an anti-Alexandrine fashion, right, under the local satrap, because they, as Hellenes, they preferred their own freedom to the one of a Macedonian ruler, right? The other kingdoms, gravitating on the Mediterranean, instead were destined to fall in the 2nd and the 1st century BC under the domination of Rome. It's in a sense very difficult to approach this topic in a cogent and systematic way, but I'm trying, in a sense, my best. Well, not quite, with tablets with headache and with a strained moral situation now, but I try because I think that that's actually an answer. That I think that telling these things to people out there is a way to cure the evils of misunderstanding, empowering the righteousness, and to make this world a better place. It's not about hating, it's not about discriminating, if not against evil, in fact. And so this shortcoming is about pointing at a standard that should be the one of scientificity and morality that we have been taught by different cultures, different people, all in this incredible synthesis that the same Greeks embodied at so many levels, and their legacy, spreading also did in this regard, that are much more of a civilizational accomplishment that we are willing to accept for the positive application in today's world, right? What is happening today is that we are gentrified enough, we're morally weak enough to be taken over by the next wave of conquerors. And this is not the cycle strictly meant, meaning that it just happens all the time. No, there are certain means and capacities, and simply history is always different, to say that we can mediate the process or also reinforce ourselves more at some point, but that we have to accept that if we don't reinforce the moral aspect of our work, we will never be able to take the reins of the process, to dictate justice in order, right? And what these things really mean in a world that has to be ruled universally according to such principles, right? So giving way to the most abject identity policy, to this sense of scientific rejection, of essentially lack of education, individual commitment, a flattening of any perspective. This is the first step to crumble, right? As a culture before then a civilization, because that's the culture that fills the gaps in this, that gives the sap, the length for a civilization to stand on its feet. And it's something so that's why this history is useful, because it shows you how fragile such balance is. How, as the ancient Persians thought of the glory of the sky, that if you had told just a single lie, right, the glory would have flown away from you, right, and you would have been lost forever, right, to the darkness, into the abjection, into nothingness, right? And that's how this darkness seems to be approaching, and we have to counter that by proving that we are worth of that faculty of command for the goodness of humanity. All right, for today, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.